In this segment, I'm going to talk about the reserve protocol, sort of from top to bottom. And I'm not going to get into all the nitty-gritty details of what the actual smart contracts are. That's covered in a different segment. But I am going to try to touch on all of the pieces, at least at a high level. So if you don't yet really know like what the protocol does mechanistically, hopefully by the end of this you'll understand. The thing is, it's really hard to figure out what order to talk about the pieces because they all sort of relate to and depend on each other a little bit. So I'm going to do my best to sort of build things up piece by piece, and I'll mention some things that maybe won't make sense, but hopefully once you hear about all the different pieces, you'll be able to imagine it working in your head. Okay, so first off, let's talk about what the collateral basket is. Every RToken is backed by some set of assets, and we call that the basket. And so what does it mean to be backed? It means that you can show up with the entire basket of assets and deposit that to mint the RToken. And then likewise, you can come and redeem that RToken for the entire basket. So this is different from like a CDP model. It's not the case that you deposit some sort of collateral and then borrow against that collateral. That's not what's happening. It's a little bit more analogous to how ETFs work, where you can deposit like all of the stocks that are part of an ETF with the issuer and get the ETF share. And then you can, redeem the ETF share and get the stocks out. There's sort of just that one-to-one redeemability where, or similarly, if you deposit, dollars with Circle to get USDC, and you can redeem USDC for dollars, it's that one-to-one issuability and redeemability, but it's a little bit ETF-like in that you're depositing a set of different tokens. Maybe it's 5 different stablecoins in equal parts, for instance, to get one reserve, RToken, or redeeming the RToken and getting all 5 of those. That doesn't permit you to show up with just one of the 5 and deposit like 5 times as much to get the RToken, or vice versa. You have to do those minting and redeeming options with the entire basket in the way that the protocol currently works. Now, there are zaps that make it so that you can show up with just one token and it'll automatically, swap on relevant dexes, figure out the best price, and then gather all those collateral assets, deposit them, and give you the relevant amount of RToken. But that's not something that's happening natively in the protocol. That's like just a smart contract function that's written as a zap on top of it. That hopefully gives you a sense of like what the basic collateral basket idea is. I want to pick like a super simple example that we can use as we talk through this. So let's say that there's an RToken that is, it consists of like 1 USDC and 1 tokenized gold token. And say those 2 tokens together constitute the basket. So it's not like some number of dollars worth of tokenized gold. It's just like 1 tokenized dollar and 1, like it's probably an ounce of tokenized gold, depending on how the issuer works. In that case, you could show up, deposit 1 of those, say USDC, and 1, say, Pax Gold token together to get the RToken. You redeem the RToken, you get 1 of each. Pretty straightforward. Now, let's talk a little bit about revenue. So an RToken can generate revenue. And there's a few ways it can do this. It can do it via lending out the underlying collateral. It can do it by getting paid by the issuers of the collateral assets who want to basically incentivize the RToken governors to include more of their asset in the basket. And it can do so via transaction fees on the RToken itself. I don't really think transaction fees will be a common revenue mechanism because nobody likes them. So I think that lending is the one that's already working in practice. It's the most common, the most obvious. I think that the fees from underlying issuers is something that I would expect to see if RTokens get very big and issuers really want to have a larger share of those baskets. But at the scale that RTokens are as of the recording of this video, that's not happening yet. Yeah, but those are the 3 main mechanisms that an RToken can generate revenue. We'll talk a little bit about where that revenue goes in a bit, but it's just helpful to know that it's there. Next concept I want to introduce is the idea of a default. So what does it mean for an RToken to be in default? Well, it just means, actually, we don't really talk about an RToken being in default. We talk about any individual collateral asset being in default or not. So let's take our example with Pax Gold and USDC. In the event that USDC were to lose its dollar peg for whatever reason, then that would probably be considered a default by that RToken. You can sort of program it to do that or not, but that's the expected behavior. And the purpose of tracking defaults in the reserve protocol is basically that the protocol was designed with the use case in mind of aggregating together tokenized assets, not necessarily just tokenized currencies, could be tokenized gold or other assets. And there's always some risk with a centralized issuer that there could be a dislocation in value between the token and the underlying that it's meant to represent, for a host of different possible reasons. There's actually one other type of default that the protocol can take into account. That's if the collateral asset is being lent out on, say, Compound or Aave or some other lending market, and that system has a problem, you could sort of see a break in redeemability there as well. So it could be that, CUSDC is supposed to be worth, whatever, 1 USDC, and suddenly it's worth 0.5 because of like a liquidity crisis or whatever, what have you, whatever sort of problem. So you can have like defaults on kind of that smart contract layer and defaults on the real world asset peg layer. And the protocol is designed to be able to track both of those. And in fact, it's flexible. You could write a collateral adapter contract that tracked even other things, but those are the main two things it's meant to track. So that's what we mean by a default. And the protocol has some logic for how to respond to defaults, which we'll get to in a bit. The next concept to layer on top of that is backup collateral assets. So when an RToken is defined initially, or when it's updated by governance, you have the existing basket of assets, in our example, USDC and Pax Gold. But then you also can define for each sort of category of collateral, like USD collateral or gold collateral, you can define a set of backup assets. So let's say for USDC, you might have you might have the Pax dollar, you might have Tether or other dollar stablecoins, maybe DAI or LUSD as backup assets. And that's basically telling the protocol like, hey, if this asset or any USD denominated asset has a default, here's an ordered list of backup assets that you can switch to without needing governance to approve that switch. And sort of getting ahead of ourselves, but that's the point of the backup collateral assets. And so the protocol defines that sort of ordered list for all the different denominations of collateral that are involved in that RToken. The next concept is overcollateralization. So overcollateralization is present. Recall, if you're issuing and redeeming one-to-one, you might think like, well, there's really no overcollateralization there. It's just one-to-one, and that is correct. However, there's another source of value, another sort of pool of value that exists within an RToken, and that's staked RSR. RSR is the reserve rights token, the governance token. And I think I'm going to talk about staking in more detail in a minute, but suffice it to say that RSR holders in some cases will come and deposit their RSR tokens on any given RToken in order to stake them and earn a portion of that revenue. And that basically provides this excess pool of capital. That excess pool of capital can come in handy if you're trying to make up for a default. So let's put those pieces together and talk about what happens in the case of a collateral default. Let's say that one of our two collateral assets, let's just randomly pick on Pax Gold, even though I don't think it would default, it's a very solid asset. Let's say that suddenly one Pax Gold token is only worth half of an ounce of gold instead of 1 ounce of gold, if that's what it's supposed to be worth. What happens? So the protocol in that instance would basically be short on value that the RToken holders are expecting to have. And so what it can do is it can seize some of those staked RSR tokens and actually trade them autonomously. Basically, it starts doing auctioning off RSR tokens to repurchase more collateral in order to make up the difference. However, obviously, if you have a collateral asset that's in default, you wouldn't want to buy more of that collateral asset. So instead what the protocol does is it checks the backup collateral assets that are available for that collateral type, in this case gold, and says like, okay, whatever it is, Tether Gold is the top choice for a backup collateral asset in the case that a gold token is defaulting. And so what it'll actually do is start by selling the collateral asset that is defaulting for whatever the appropriate backup is. And again, it does that via auctions becoming triggerable, and those auctions occur and collateral gets swapped out, and arbitrageurs are incentivized to participate in those auctions because they can charge a little bit of a spread and make money. And then once the new collateral has been purchased, whatever gap is left between what the protocol was meant to have and what it actually has will be made up by seizing RSR tokens and auctioning those off for the remaining collateral needed. The amount of RSR that's staked on an RToken may or may not be enough to handle any given default. So there's no guarantee there. It's not the case that I'm saying that like no matter what the default is, Rtoken holders will always be made whole. It's just that all of the value that exists in that staked RSR is available to be seized and basically spent to make the Rtoken holders whole. So if you were to have 100% over-collateralization, then you could actually handle 100% default. If you had only 20% over-collateralization from that staked RSR, then you could handle a default in value for the whole Rtoken up to 20%. One more detail there. You might wonder, how does the protocol choose which backup asset to use in the case of a default to replace the defaulting asset? The way that that works is that the list of collateral backups is ordered for each type of collateral, say gold in this case. Governance also sets, it's ordered by governance, and governance also sets what's called a diversity factor. So let's say you had 10 backup collateral assets. You could have, if you had a diversity factor of 1, then the protocol would just pick whatever is the highest ranked backup collateral asset. If you had a diversity factor of 3, it would actually replace whatever collateral's in default with 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 of the top 3 backup collateral assets. And it does one more check, which is it checks to make sure that the backup collateral assets that it's moving in are not themselves in default, because that could potentially be the case. And it does that by relying on Oracle price feeds. So as long as a certain backup collateral asset has been trading at what it's supposed to be, it's eligible to be used for that replacement in that case. One thing that's really cool about this mechanism with staked RSR being seized is that RSR stakers are often involved in the governance of an Rtoken. They don't have to be, we'll get to that in a second, but oftentimes they are. And this mechanism means that they are the first loss capital in the case of a default. So if something goes wrong with one of the collateral assets, they're going to lose capital before the Rtoken holders do. It would only be the case that if the RSR holders are completely wiped out, beyond then do Rtoken holders take a loss. And so that gives the RSR stakers a very strong incentive to pick collateral assets that are not going to default, because it's just very financially costly for them directly. So you might wonder, how do Rtoken holders know that they won't end up losing money? And the shortest high-level answer is they don't. Like I explained, if that RSR over-collateralization is not sufficient, then Rtoken holders could lose money in the case of a default. In general, some Rtokens will be safe and conservative and others won't be. The risks, though, will often be apparent. But really each Rtoken has to earn its own reputation and build up its own track record over time. Just because one Rtoken is good and conservative and safe doesn't mean that another is. RPay, by the way, will generally only list Rtokens that are clearly very low risk. And we expect that to be similar for other financial platforms, at least ones that are acting responsibly. So that may be helpful for some end users, but still, if you're a platform operator, you have to think about, is this Rtoken safe or not? And it may or may not be. You have to think about that critically. One cool new innovation in the crypto world is a stablecoin rating agency called Blue Chip. That's a nonprofit that just looks at stablecoins and analyzes from an economic perspective, are they safe or not? That's, if Blue Chip chooses to rate Rtokens over the course of time, then that could be something that would be helpful to individual users for making decisions. And Blue Chip ratings, I think, could also be useful for Rtoken governors in thinking about underlying collateral assets and deciding, what should be part of a basket or what should be part of emergency collateral, that sort of backup basket. And so I think that it's really cool that that service exists, and I hope that works. I'm personally a supporter of Blue Chip. A good question here is, can what happened to Terra, sort of Terra Luna as many people call it, can that happen to an Rtoken? And the answer is well, not like that. Like an Rtoken itself doesn't have a mechanism that is really anything like UST, in that what's pegging the Rtoken to this external reference is exactly that set of assets. The Rtoken is pegged to and redeemable for the same thing. And so the same type of risk doesn't exist. However, it's important to remember that there could be risky Rtokens that include collateral that has those same properties or risks, right? With when UST existed as a pegged asset on Ethereum, you could have had an RToken that had UST as part of its collateral basket. And so then it can inherit, RTokens can inherit the risk from whatever it is that is contained within them. But yeah, it's important to remember that Reserve is a little bit like Ethereum this way, where, it can be used to create safe and reasonable things, as well as like ridiculous Ponzi's. Because of the fact that anything can be put into an RToken basket, it's important to look at that backing and think about how it's governed and what can be added in the future in order to make sure that you're not holding an RToken that's not safe. Okay, so let's talk about staking a little bit more directly. To be clear, we use the term staking in a way that is kind of similar to proof of stake, although not exactly the same. But it's more similar to the traditional use of the term staking and proof of stake than it is to a bunch of the uses of that term that happened in the last bull market. So this is not just a mechanism to like pay token holders to lock up their tokens and not dump them, which is what staking has sort of come to mean in many contexts. You are actually putting your RSR at stake if you stake it. And that's the source of the term in proof of stake protocols. Let's think about the economics of staking. So basically, when an RToken generates revenue, there's a revenue split that's definable by governance. It's set by the person who deploys the RToken and then can be updated over time by governance to direct whatever percentage of that revenue to the RToken holders themselves. Basically the RToken itself can just get more valuable versus to RSR stakers. And you can actually direct the revenue to any arbitrary set of Ethereum addresses, and that's a whole flexible thing. It's pretty cool. But so what this means is that the more of the revenue from a given RToken that is directed to RSR stakers, the more over-collateralization capital you expect to exist on that RToken because there's a greater incentive to stake on that RToken versus others. Also, the expected loss from any hypothetical default reduces the staking value, the value of staking on that RToken, and thus should reduce staking demand. So if you have an RToken that has very large amount of revenue, very large portion of that revenue is going to stakers, and it's safe revenue, the collateral assets that underlie that RToken are relatively safe, that's going to be sort of in general, that's going to attract the largest pool of stakers. Whereas you could have really high revenues and a lot of it going to stakers, but if that's happening because of like super degen backing and things that are pretty likely to blow up, then you might still get relatively little staking because the stakers are going to be concerned about taking that risk. When you stake an RSR in an RToken, there's always an unstaking delay, and that's there so that stakers can't just decide to bail at the first sign of potential trouble. They're kind of making a little bit of a commitment. I think a lot of our tokens so far have used a 2-week unstaking delay. And it's also the case that if a default is triggered, then once that default's triggered, all of the RSR that's staked is sort of locked in until that all gets sorted out, until the RToken gets fully recapitalized. And so those two mechanics together make it so that you can't really stake and then just pull your staked RSR if like suddenly you think that there's a default happening. All right. Let's talk about how the basket gets updated. Because, basket gets defined when an RToken is deployed, but over the course of time, it makes sense for it to evolve. The short answer is token voting, except that's not really right, because an RToken just has an owner role, and that owner role can actually be assigned to any Ethereum address. So it could be an EOA, it could be a multisig, it could be any smart contract. There's sort of an off-the-shelf governance mechanism that you could choose when you deploy an RToken, and that does use token voting. But it's not that all reserve rights token holders can vote on every RToken. Rather, only RSR holders that stake their RSR on a particular RToken are eligible to participate in its governance under that framework. We don't really think that that's the long-term solution to RToken governance, nor do we really think that token voting in general is the long-term solution to DeFi governance overall. So we think that it's important to improve. The Reserve team does have some attention put on governance and coming up with other governance options. But part of the reason why the protocol itself has this modular structure where there's just an owner address and anything can control it is in order to encourage experimentation with governance above and beyond anything that the core team thinks about. Once the basket is changed, then an actual rebalancing has to happen. And again, the mechanism for that is actually modular. There can be different ways of the protocol making changes to the basket, but right now it happens via auctions. Actually, the initial way that the protocol worked by default was with batch auctions, and there is a new version of the code that works with Dutch auctions. But you could also have a version that works with AMMs that basically allows the protocol to make trades directly on DEXs with automated market making functionality. The challenge there is MEV, where basically a smart contract can't always make a good decision about what maximum or minimum price to set the way that a human trading with an AMM can. And so it's sort of necessary to have some solution to MEV if you're going to trade on a DEX as a protocol. Now, I've talked about deploying Rtokens a little bit throughout this process, and sort of hinted at the fact that anyone can do it, but that is true, and I want to talk about that a little bit. So the version of the reserve protocol that was deployed by the core team is basically implements the factory contract pattern. So you can call a factory contract to deploy a new Rtoken. It basically creates sort of a new copy that runs with the reserve protocol code, and anybody can do that with no permission. This is a lot like how anyone can deploy a Uniswap trading pair. And as a result of that, there's like 30,000 plus Uniswap trading pairs because people can just try whatever they want. There is also a profit incentive to deploy an Rtoken because you can deploy it and direct some of the revenue to yourself. It's kind of like creating this thing and then making yourself an employee of it in a way. I would liken it more to being an employee than a shareholder because you don't have any sort of irrevocable claim to profits that the Rtoken generates, and that's because governors can always choose to update the revenue distribution of that Rtoken and stop directing it to you. So unless you sort of hold dominating control of the governance, then at least with the current governing framework, you're kind of like an employee that can get fired. And so if you don't continue providing services to that Rtoken, it's probably the case that eventually, at least, you would stop receiving that cut. But maybe you'd receive it for quite a while. And that's enough incentive to deploy because deploying is actually very easy. You can do it in actually just a few minutes without writing any code, just using a web app. I guess there's one last note I want to make on the profit incentive, which is I think in principle you could design a governing setup where there is an irrevocable portion of the revenue share where basically the revenue split can't be updated within the Rtoken itself, and it actually gets divided up in some other smart contract. And so then you could sort of create the notion of shareholders or a sort of fixed revenue distribution, but that's not part of the protocol at the base layer. If you want to deploy an Rtoken, it can either be like really easy or really hard. The easy kind would be if you deploy an Rtoken that uses collateral that's already been used in other Rtokens, because then there will already be collateral adapter contracts available. Collateral adapter contract basically defines like what a default is for that type of collateral and like which Oracle price feeds to pay attention to in order to decide whether a default is occurring, a couple other things like that. If you need to write the code for a new collateral asset, you have to be a developer, and you probably want to get that contract audited. It's not very much code, so it's not that expensive to audit, but it takes a lot more time than if you're just like pointing and clicking and selecting collateral adapters that have already been written, which is super, super easy. The other thing is if you use the off-the-shelf governing mechanism, that's also just like checking a box and hitting deploy. And so using existing collateral assets and the off-the-shelf governing mechanism, you can deploy in 5 minutes in a web app. Or you could go write your own governance contract, you could write your own collateral adapters, it could be like, months and months of expensive development. But, we wanted the protocol to be like fully extensible for those who wanted to do that with it. And because there could end up being such strong financial incentives, if this gets popular, there could be many people that spend a lot of time and effort writing a lot of custom code, whereas, maybe a lot of the early Rtokens will just be deployed with that simple web app. You might wonder, why did we make Rtoken deployment permissionless rather than having there be some governance process, that could maybe prevent there being sketchy Rtokens? On the high level, the basic idea is to apply the same competitive force of capitalism to the domain of currency. We just think that having open competition in the long term is likely to create better currency products for the world. And I love that I mentioned that Uniswap example of like 30,000 plus trading pairs. Some of them are very popular. Many are not, and that's fine. Just letting the free market decide is, in some domains, a great way to get to sort of the best options out there. Also, you can imagine if an RToken has gotten big and ossified and you see some better approach, but you can't convince whatever the governing body is to try it, you can just make a new startup RToken and promote it. And if it catches on, then you might make money and everybody benefits. Just like, if there's an incumbent company like Google or Facebook or Amazon or whatever, and you have a startup idea that might do something better than one of those, you can just go try that. One thing I like about that is that it keeps incumbents on their toes, right? Like a lot of those big companies, they're thinking about like, well, okay, if we don't keep innovating, then someone else might figure out a better product. So it causes those big incumbents to actually increase their own quality because of that external pressure of competition. The sense of working a little bit like Ethereum, right? Ethereum allows anyone to build things. Not trying to, it's not like the Ethereum team tried to create all the things that could be built on top of smart contract platform themselves. And that's obviously gone very well for exploring all the possibilities so far. And then finally, it allows for experimentation with governance design. And I think it's actually really healthy to have there be a long tail of RTokens, some of which are smaller, because once something starts to get big, it's very scary to experiment with new mechanisms, especially new governing mechanisms. And so having there be some small things, I think is valuable for being able to get out of the box a little bit and try different approaches to governance. And that could end up being really essential for figuring out the appropriate overall governing paradigm for RTokens in the long term. So hopefully that quick description gives you some understanding of at least the different pieces that are part of an RToken, even if you can't fully imagine all the mechanisms working. If you look at our written documentation with this context in mind, hopefully you'll be able to make sense a little bit more of what the pieces are and how they fit together. Now, zooming way out. In the long term, I think that there are two really big challenges that have to be overcome for the reserve protocol to be usable in the way that we intend, which is the creation of asset-backed currencies backed by all manner of tokenized assets. One thing, pretty obviously, is everything has to be tokenized, right? So if we're going to make currencies that are backed by an index of the world's assets, those assets have to be on chain. The second is, as I've touched on a number of times in the past few minutes, decentralized governance design, because token voting has a lot of issues, and other designs that have been tried largely haven't done much better. And so, it's really a hard problem, right? Like we're talking about a problem that's similarly difficult to thinking about like, okay, you have like a new state, what should the rules be for how it's going to work? Knowing that, if it gets big and powerful, then there'll be tons of politicking and tons of optimization pressure to try to co-opt it and so on. Tokenization and governance design I see as like the biggest really long-term overall challenges. How do we expect RTokens to look over time? I think that they'll be mostly US dollar denominated to start, and I think they'll basically be mostly various mixes of like DeFi USD positions. Because you can mix and match various positions in DeFi with assets being lent out or, LP positions and other things like that to have, US dollar DeFi positions that generate some revenue for a dollar-based RToken. Eventually, though, I hope to see more and more diversified RTokens, and if everything gets tokenized, I think that will start to be possible.